story. You guys should know this one. He kills Goliath. He does not only kill Goliath, he's also killed a lion and a bear with his bare hands. Okay, so he's tending flock, and like a lion or a bear will come, and he literally attacks the lion and the bear to save his flock. Do we have any hunters in the room? Nobody hunts? A couple? I'll pick on some hunters. Hunting today, we feed the animals for like a year straight to get them to come to this little spot that we want them to go to. And we perch up high in a tree until they finally come to the place where we've been constantly feeding them, and then we cap them. David tracked down a lion and a bear and killed them with his bare hands. So David was an absolute beast, and his army was an absolute beast. So David takes over as king. 10 minutes. We gotta go.
Yeah. You need my kind of talking.
I do. I got it. So David takes over as king, and all these nations that continue to threaten the borders of Israel, he just wrecks shop on them. David just goes to town, and Israel experiences this time of absolute flourishing because they're winning all of these battles. David gives his kingdom over to his son, Solomon. And Solomon, the only king in Israel, experiences complete peace during his time. The borders of Israel are at complete peace. Solomon is rich, he is wealthy, he has wisdom beyond wisdom. But you begin to see Solomon worry if you look at his writings in Ecclesiastes. He says, what good is wealth and power if your kids are idiots and you have to hand it over to them? That's a paraphrase. But he's saying, what good is all of this if I know my kids are morons and I have to hand it over to them? So that's exactly what happens. Israel flourishes. Solomon gives the kingdom over to his sons, and everything just completely goes downhill from there. So, my wife told me this was boring, but I'm going to quick share it anyway. So there's just incredibly bad king after bad king after bad king after Solomon. What God says is to these people and to the king, if you continue in these ways, I'm going to send these neighboring nations, and they're going to wreck shop on you. They do not listen. So Assyria comes in first, destroys Israel. Babylon comes in next, takes over from Assyria. Persia comes in next, takes over from Babylon. And so why I want to add that, some people think it's boring, I think it's absolutely fascinating. If you go read your history books, this is exactly what happens. Like the Bible records what actually happens. It's a true story. So look at all of the kings after Saul, David, Solomon. Those are in your history books. Those are actual kings who ruled, who screwed up royally. These are actual countries that conquered Israel. And so where are we at in the story? Persia has completely taken over the Israelites. They've completely taken over Jerusalem. The Israelites are exiled into these foreign nations. Okay? Go back one second. So they're exiled into the foreign nations. And the story ends historically in the Old Testament with God saying to the king of Persia, basically giving you permission to send this guy Nehemiah back to Jerusalem. He can start to rebuild the city. And so historically, the Old Testament ends. We have Nehemiah going back and beginning to rebuild Jerusalem. And some of these exiles are starting to return to the city of Jerusalem. And then we just stop and we kind of don't know what happens from there for 400 years. So that's what stops historically in the Old Testament. Next slide. In the middle of the Bible, we get this random wisdom literature, which is exactly that. It's wisdom. So the book of Job demonstrates for us the depths of human suffering and how to wrestle with God in the midst of it. Psalms, praises to God and songs of victory. Proverbs, generic wisdom on how to be successful in life. Ecclesiastes, whatever we try to find lasting joy in during this life apart from God will fail us horribly. That was written by Solomon, who had absolutely everything. He tried every pleasure, and he said, in the end, it was all vanity and chasing after the wind. And then we get Songs of Solomon, same guy, and that book is a celebration of sex within the marital relationship. So that should not, hopefully not surprise any of you that God created sex. It is absolutely celebrated in Song of Solomon. It's almost like erotic love poetry in the Bible. God created it. Okay, so that's smack dab in the middle of the Old Testament. Keep going. So these people are exiled by the Persians, right? They begin to come back. The rest of the Old Testament, we got these books of prophets. What's the point of the prophets? Well, the prophets were really speaking to three groups of people during this time. The first set of prophets, I don't actually know the order that they were in, but I know they were speaking to one of these three groups. One, prophets were trying to warn Israelites before the exile that if they don't get their act together, God would punish them through these neighboring nations. So you'll see in some of these prophets saying, Israel, you need to listen up because God's coming with these other nations. Start obeying these commands or God's coming at you. Two, they encourage the Israelites during the exile that God has a plan in place. So when they're off in exile in Persia, in Babylon, the prophets are writing to that group too, saying, God's got a plan in place. Trust Him. He said through Abraham's offspring. Take hope. And then thirdly, there's the group that's coming back. The group that's coming back with Nehemiah to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. The prophets are encouraging them, saying, keep going. God's got a plan in place. You're His people. He is your God. Don't lose heart. So the Old Testament ends with them rebuilding the walls. We get 400 years of silence, which the Bible doesn't talk about. We know from history that, you guys remember Alexander the Great? Yep, he conquered the Persians, and then, do you remember who conquered him? Starts with an R. The Romans, right? And so, beginning of the New Testament, next slide. We start with New Testament. Romans are now ruling. We have God's people from Israel in Jerusalem, but under the rule of the Romans. In Matthew, the first book of the New Testament, will start like this. So we get 400 years of silence where God's people are wondering, where's God? What's He doing? What's the plan? I thought He was going to raise somebody up. What are we supposed to do? Matthew 1, a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ. First person. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob the father. It goes all the way through genealogically from Abraham and traces it to Jesus. Why would Matthew start off the New Testament like that? To connect it. What's he saying by connecting Jesus to Abraham? He's keeping His promise, yes. Jesus is the Messiah. Jesus is the promised one that we learned about in Genesis 11. So Matthew connects the dots. He says, look at this history. This guy who is absolutely perfect, who claims to be the Son of God, who claims to be able to forgive people of sins, who heals the blind, who raises people from the dead. His genealogy, we can trace it all the way back to Abraham. This is the God, this is the Messiah, the chosen one. God said He's going to fix everything. This is the guy who's going to do it with. So a lot of people were expecting Jesus to come by force because that's really what happened historically, but Jesus does not come by force. He shocked a lot of people with that. So they recognized Jesus is the guy in the line of Abraham. He lives the perfect life. He ushered in a new and final covenant as He sacrificed Himself for us. So we said earlier, right out of the gate, that when we sin, there needs to be a blood payment for that. Jesus, fully God, fully human, sacrificed Himself for us because He is also fully God. His blood is eternal blood. There's no restrictions on how much blood eternal blood can cover. That's why when God ushers in this new covenant with Jesus sacrificing Himself on the cross, as we learned in the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and God, tracing the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, that God has put a new plan in place where He said, you guys, despite your best efforts, cannot live up to my standards. I've shown you throughout all of human history that is not possible. So because I love you, because I'm active, because I'm personal, because I'm relentlessly intentional, because you can't do it, I'm going to do it for you. Christianity is the only religious system in the world that God comes to us, that God fixes that human problem for us. And He does it through the life, death, and the resurrection of His Son, Jesus. And so we can trace the entire storyline of Jesus throughout the Old Testament. As you look through some of those people in Matthew, the Old Testament talks about every single one of those people. It is absolutely crazy to trace the line of Jesus throughout the Old Testament. 66 books all come together to tell one complete story. So, how much time do I got?
37.
5 seconds.